Hello and welcome. My name is Tarun Nagesh. I'm Curatorial Manager of Asian and Pacific Art here at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal lands where I'm speaking from here on Kurilpa Point and where the gallery stands. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, in particular the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and their future leaders. You're watching a virtual talk here held in conjunction with the 10th Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art, APT10, at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. Today's program is a discussion with one of our artists in the exhibition, Sumakshi Singh. And it's my great pleasure to be joined by Sumakshi today, who's speaking to us from her home in Gurgaon in India. Sumakshi currently lives in between Gurgaon and Goa in India. Also has a studio in Gurgaon just outside of Delhi. Sumakshi is a really highly acclaimed artist who has an extensive career exhibiting around the world, as well as really consistently showing in major platforms in India. An artist as well as an educator, having first studied in Baroda before spending several years at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and has also lectured at Oxford University, Columbia University, many others which I won't go into. Sumakshi really spends her time teaching, mentoring, curating, as well as presenting major installations in biennales and exhibitions all around the world. So very delighted to say a very warm welcome to Sumakshi today. I thought it would be wonderful to really explore some of the history of Sumakshi's practice that leads into her work being presented for APT10, which is really a new body of work that we're very excited to be showing. Sumakshi, I thought I'd start by asking that, thinking about how your practice has been particularly responsive to environments, I feel. And many of the earlier works were very distinctly relied on an ephemerality and were very much site-specific. I was interested in how some of this drew back to thinking about nature, and particularly some of the projects you developed after moving from Baroda to Chicago, where you began thinking about nature differently, I've heard you speak about, and how this related to the idea of micro-interventions as well.
Thank you, Tarun, and thank you, APT. I'm really excited to be a part of this show. So to answer your question, I moved from Baroda to Chicago in 2001. And, in India, it's really common to see trees growing out of the sides of buildings and all these very quirky, surprising interactions of architecture and nature. And everywhere you look, there's like a little surprise. And then I moved to Chicago, which is possibly, and to downtown Chicago, which is possibly one of the most manicured areas in the world. And the trees were the same height and shape. There were no weeds on the sidewalk. And it was really the first time that I saw, the landscape being converted into another form of architecture, into boxed categories. And, it was a landscape of highly manicured, manipulated nature, always presented at its best. And to me, it was quite strange, to take part of something that was like a nuanced and complex natural cycle, and to just isolate this one part of it and present it for human consumption in a way. And so what started to happen was that a lot of my work at the time in 2001 in Chicago started to resemble these weeds that were growing out of sidewalks, or a fungus or a mushroom, or that part of nature that hadn't yet been pre-processed and packaged for easy human consumption. So there was that value system I felt of the meta landscape in Chicago, which seemed to talk about a kind of immediate gratification, like a bypass the journey and just concentrate on the destination. And I think I wanted to fill in some other parts of that story with this work. And so this body of work, which I call the micro intervention, started. And apart from, these sculptural pieces that would be kind of growing out of the wall and the floor and the ceiling, what I also did was I would often accompany them with a bit of scarring on the wall, a little lumps or bumps or cracks, so it would look like the wall is bubbling up. And so actually at some point it became quite impossible for viewers to tell which part was artistic intervention and which part was pre-existing. And so that idea of how much is the art and how much isn't is sort of a question that, each viewer sort of confronted in their own mind, and either, released their boundaries of where something could stop or start being part of that art viewing experience. And the other thing with these pieces was it also became quite impossible to see where the piece began or ended, because they all seemed to just proliferate into each other's territories, because viewers were spending as much time looking at the wall in between the pieces as they did at the pieces themselves. So in a way, what was really the negative space or the ground or the invisible sort of becomes visible, and it becomes the figure, and there's a kind of reversal of background, foreground that starts to take place. So that was the micro intervention body of work.
And so I guess that really took you, it seems like from very early on, it took you straight out of the studio. You seem to be responding to environments really from the outset, finding other places to place works or work in, but also really break down, viewing an art object as an individual thing, as distinct from the environment it sits in. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, and I think that also another aspect to this is that, what I'd started to discover was that once viewers were in the space, like looking at cracks in the wall, lumps in the wall, and they were giving it that kind of attention, actually that way of looking also proliferated out of the gallery. So there were projects where I literally had the work going out of the gallery. But there was also this way of looking that continued, where I'd get viewers calling me, a week later saying, hey, there's a hole in the wall at the Red Line subway stop with fungus in it. Is this your artwork? Or, suddenly somebody looking at a weed in their garden differently. And I realized the gallery was almost serving like a kind of highlighter tool that was sort of highlighting something that was present but not always visible, and allowing people to reevaluate their own visual environments as a result of having triggered that way of looking over there. And then there was pieces where the work literally came out of the gallery, and that was also a very interesting learning for me, because I would see viewers walk past the work, and then as they would approach that threshold of the gallery space, they'd start looking suspiciously at it, wondering whether this was part of the art or not. And then once they'd crossed the threshold of that space where, now they're ready to view intellectual, cultural activity, they would suddenly come back out and look at it differently. And so it really started to show me how the permission we give ourselves and how we perceive things, or the conditioning with which we view them, really changes the meaning we construct around them.
And it sounds like a very strong awareness of the possibilities of the viewer as well, really playing with this sense of the viewer experience and kind of, and the little gaps in between reality and convention, perhaps, which kind of leads me on to the next question I wanted to ask you about, which is that, there is this prevalence of your practice being rooted in drawing. And that these drawing installations began manifesting, but projects really to explore illusion, playing with perception and interactivity, what you've called sketches in space, I know, but which led to you actually kind of constructing a drawn environment, but then you would play with illusion and perspective. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of those projects and what the kind of driving motivations were that you were exploring in those.
So I think there were many different things happening at the time. And this is now we're moving to around 2006. And part of it was having worked with the micro interventions and sort of seeing how much of how we construct meaning and therefore construct reality is based on our individual unique perceptions, but also how contingent those perceptions are on where we are standing in space and in time. So is it something that we are viewing filtered through the lens of memory or nostalgia, and how does that change the perception of it? Or even time in a different way, like if I am perceiving something right after, if I'm in tune with a more elemental, slower rhythm of time inside me, like if I've just finished a beautiful walk in nature, or I've just been watching my breath or meditating and I'm perceiving something, that's going to be different from when I'm perceiving it when I'm caught in a more surface rhythm of time, which is more frantic and deadline based and future oriented. But also in space, so I would start looking at everyday objects in my studio, like a ladder or a stool, and noticed how that was creating an image in my brain, but that image could only exist from that one specific vantage point, because if I moved my head 1 inch, that image shifted and the previous image would break. And so I really started to see how fragile and fickle our perceptions were, and how interesting it was that we were constructing our reality based on these really fragile perceptions, actually. So that was one thing that was going on. And also I was noticing how, as I was staring at these objects, just how, my image was flattening them out into two-dimensional, my eyes were flattening them out into two-dimensional images, right? Like that ladder standing there, for it to look like that, if it was a two-dimensional image, I would have to actually draw it on the floor, draw it on a wall, draw it on a column, and then it would only work from there. And if I shifted my head, it would fall apart. And how in perspective, like something's always hidden or exaggerated. And so for the first time, just the mechanics of like everyday vision started to become like this mystery for me, where I wanted to spend more time with it. The other thing that was happening was, my grandfather passed away in 2006, and the family home, which the project at APT is also based on, is 33 Link Road in Lajpat Nagar in Delhi. And this is a home they built right after partition of India in 1950. They built it, 52. And they built it bit by bit, brick by brick. And, for my entire life, this has been the family home. This has been listed as a permanent address in all official documents, because as a nuclear family, my father, mother, my brother, and I, we traveled all over the country. Every 2 years, we had a new house and lived in a different state. So this was really like the only constant home that we came back to year after year. And we were so familiar with all the objects in this home, and everything was always in the same place and sort of frozen in a time. And my grandfather had shared these incredible stories about all these things and in his living room, and how he'd got them by winning a bet with a Maharaja, or, there were these incredible stories. And after he passed away, it was a very uncanny experience, walking through this space, because although I knew what everything was, my perception of them had changed and they no longer felt the same. And I wanted to digest that gap between my perception and my knowledge. And so I did my first major illusion-based project. I was living in France at the time, and I drew out the illusion of his living room with all its objects on all the pre-existing objects in my studio in France. So from the vantage point of the entrance of the room, it looked like my grandfather's living room was right there. And then as one starts to walk in, the illusion starts to skew and then finally shatter, and one starts to see all the real objects on which it's been drawn, which is like a trash can and a chair and the floor and a shelf and a shutter and a canvas, etc. And as the viewers sort of walk into this space, which is where their direct perception of this space is actually quite fractured and disorienting, they simultaneously see themselves on a projection on screen. And in this projection, they are in the lined up illusion of my grandfather's living room. So they are sort of negotiating being in both spaces at the same time and trying to understand, the implications that an action they create in this space, moving their arm like this or moving the body like this, what implication does it have in that space? Because there, it looks like they're cutting through a table or moving through a cushion or intersecting a solid object. Also, this piece was drawn in chalk pastel, and I called it Mapping the Memory Mandala, because the idea was that basically as viewers enter and walk through this space, the image will start to blur because of their movement. It'll start to, finally get erased. And, so I can say goodbye to that fixed memory or perception of my grandfather's space. And then I collected the dust from the installation at the end of it. So it was really a way of digesting many of these things. And I think it threw up a lot of questions for me about transience and, the nature of reality and what is permanent and unchanging, and how do we see things, and, what does it feel like to walk into an abstract map of your own vision? Mm. Also, I'd been meditating for a few years at this point, and, thinking a lot about, the yogis talking about this idea of Maya, which is, the world basically being illusory, and it seems real because we're putting our energy into our belief that it's real. And so then these illusions took on a few different forms, where I started to, I was thinking, what would it feel like to inhabit a space that I knew was an illusion? And what would it feel like to be interacting with things all day long, knowing that they're illusory? And so then I did a series of these animations where I interacted with all these virtual objects as if they were real, as if, like a coffee cup that was drawn on the table and then on my shirt and on my face. And as I moved it in stop motion animation, it would look like I'm drinking this cup of coffee or shifting through a book, etc. So, and then this took on many, many other different forms and formats.
Mm. And then I guess that leads us to, I mean, it is this, I guess, process rooted in drawing, but it brings in other media. But then I guess we move on to bodies of work that you've seemingly focused on for the last few years, which I know you've called thread drawings, which is perhaps we can call them embroidered sculptures in some sense. And I guess they seemingly appear, quite different from your earlier practice, but I see so many resonances. But one is that they have these very personal stories have carried through. Your focus on your grandparents' house, also learning from your mother how to embroider. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how this kind of first started developing, working with embroidery. Similarly, quite an intimate, personal way of working, like drawing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think what almost all the bodies of work have in common is that there is a kind of looking into transience, substance and insubstantiality, what happens to form after it loses its function, or just before it's given its function. So everything is about this transition where things are shifting, and so like a lot of the earlier work as well, I think it's about creating a space which maybe hasn't yet been crystallized by our conditioning or our perceptions. So it's almost like being in this sort of primordial soup of potential energy, where the polarities, where the roles get fixed, where it's decided that, okay, you're going to be the background, you're going to be the object, you're going to be physical, you're going to be illusory. All those things haven't yet quite decided. And so they're sort of in this more flexible, fluid state. And so everything seems a little bit insubstantial and a little bit like a shimmering mirage in a way. And I think all these bodies have that in common. With this body of work, my basically my mother was a really accomplished embroiderer, and she passed away in 2013. And as a way of sort of reconnecting with her, I'd started to trace out all the words from her letters to me and to start embroidering them. And then when I got done fixing her words, it was as it seemed like the words didn't want to be fixed, and they were protesting being stuck like this. And it was almost like they wanted to be permeated with space and to levitate. So then I started cutting out the fabric, and then I tried it on transparent fabric, and I tried like various things, and none of them seemed to work. And then finally, I invited my mother's embroiderer to come work with me in the studio. And he recommended this material, which is actually soluble. And so we tried it on that, and we embroidered the letter on that, and then dissolved the fabric away. And just left with these lace words of this imprint on air. And that felt like that's what they wanted. And from that, then I started embroidering these different plants from her garden. So she was also an incredible gardener, and all the different houses that we lived in, she would create these magical gardens that I think everyone wanted to move into that house when it was time for us to leave because of these gardens, you know. And she would often take plants from this garden and press them and send them to me with the letters. And so we started making this sort of very skeletal kind of archive of personal memory that developed. And then finally, over time, they ended up becoming large, full-scale, three-dimensional, immersive gardens that one could walk through. And that sort of finally led to this project, which is at APT, where, you know, this family home, which I think for years has just offered us this promise of constancy, permanence, and like the solid shelter, has turned into this like ethereal memory. I think my most of my memories around that house have to do with my grandmother, and a lot of them have to do with her sitting knitting and embroidering in the sun in the garden, and us spending hours doing that. And so I wanted to convert like these hard architectural surfaces into something that was soft and feminine and made out of thread, and something ethereal and almost ghost-like or weightless, like a memory, you know?
I keep thinking about those thread drawings in relationship to the pressed flower in the book. It becomes flat, but you know, there's time instilled in it, but it's also incredibly fragile as well. And I know there were some of those early works were these gardens and these flowers, sometimes framed like they look like a pressed flower. But they started becoming these architectural fragments, which, as you mentioned, continued from those early installations, exploring your grandparents' home, and I guess focusing on each sculpture kind of focusing on a particular architectural feature of the house. But I think that brings you to this next series in that 33 Link Road, which I know you've called Afterlife to tie it all together, this most recent group of works, in which you seem to really think more about deconstructing these forms. You know, they're presented almost like they're being undone, they're fragmented, they create shadows, they wrap around themselves or fold. And so it was interesting for me, it started bringing back some of these earlier ideas of illusion, of deconstruction, of perception. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, you know, building these incredibly delicate forms as a structure and then starting now to deconstruct them.
Yes. What was interesting was, you know, I actually first, because I didn't have access to the house initially when I started this body of work. So I first made a few windows and doors based on memory. I had the approximate sizes in mind, and I said, okay, this is how they look like, and you know, and I did it. And then when I went into the house and I measured everything, I realized it was all wrong. and I had, messed up all the proportions. But strangely enough, when I saw them side by side, the one that I'd actually made from memory felt more real to me than the ones that actually followed the exact measurement. So when I first made that body of work, my grandmother was still alive, although she'd moved out of the house and was living in Bangalore, and now she's passed away. And I think that, now that reality of what I was saying earlier, which is that, this home and these forms have so lovingly held this function for so many years, which is now starting to kind of, it's lost its purpose and it's losing its form. And I think that's part of what this unraveling is about, is also like that form, the architecture, starting to slowly dissolve back into its material, which is thread. I also feel like we're in this really, unique and interesting moment in human history right now, where because of this pause caused by the pandemic, I think so many of our old structures seem to be unraveling, or, social structures for sure, with all the social isolation we've all gone through. Political structures, that getting more and more polarized, economic structures, our medical systems in India definitely went through a total unraveling. The environment seems to be in this, unraveling mode as well. But I do feel like this gift of time we've been given is sort of allowing a kind of perhaps a shape shifting or a mutation, where we're thinking again about our stories and thinking again about who we thought we were and what is our relationship to time and how we do things. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether we fall back into the older patterns, or whether, something new comes out of this. And so I think this work that's there at APT definitely also speaks to this sort of moment in time where so much is sort of shifting, changing. It's in that mode where it's like it's a form and it's architectural, but it's also thread and it flops and it can't hold its structure. And it's all simultaneous. And it's also waiting to see what it'll become, or whether it'll just dissolve, or what's going to happen with it. Mystery.
Suggests so much change and uncertainty ahead as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sumakshi. It's been wonderful for you to join us, and you speak very generously on your work. So thank you very much. It's been great to speak.
Thank you.